The badge on her chest said Custodial Services, and that was exactly how Dr. Holt wanted it. He'd made that clear on her first day. She was standing in the break room refilling the paper towel dispenser when he walked in, took one look at her, and said to the charge nurse beside him, "Someone needs to tell facilities that the supply closet on the second floor is a biohazard. Have the cleaning crew handle it before rounds." She was standing 3 feet away. She didn't say anything. She finished loading the dispenser, gathered her cart, and wheeled it out. Her name was Ivy Crane. She was 34 years old, and she had forgotten more about emergency trauma care than most people in that building would ever learn. Millhaven Community Medical Center wasn't much. A 60-bed facility in a county that hadn't grown in 20 years, serving a population that was mostly elderly, mostly underinsured, and mostly resigned to driving 40 miles to the regional hospital for anything serious. Seriously, the ER was a converted corridor. The OR had 2 suites. The ICU had 8 beds and ran on 3 nurses most nights. Ivy had taken the custodial job 9 months ago. She'd answered the listing online. Facilities technician, part-time, flexible schedule, and shown up in jeans and a flannel shirt with no explanation for the gap on her resume. The HR coordinator, a tired woman named Mrs. Ortega, had looked at the application for about 8 seconds before stamping it approved. Bodies were hard to come by. Questions were a luxury. She liked the work. There was honesty in it. You mopped a floor. The floor was clean. You fixed a leaking fixture in room 12. The drip stopped. Nobody died because you got tired or distracted or made the wrong call at 200 with your hands inside someone's chest cavity and a sandstorm blackening the sky outside the tent. She preferred it this way. The only person on staff who'd ever looked at her twice, really looked, past the gray uniform in the push cart, was a patient transport aide named Dominique. She was 22, big laugh, asked too many questions, and had once said to Ivy, completely unprompted, "You move like someone who's used to carrying heavy things, not boxes, like weight." Then she'd pushed her gurney down the hall, and that had been that. Ivy had thought about that for 3 days. Dr. Holt ran the ER with the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong in front of an audience. He was 48, salt and pepper, looked good in his coat, and had spent 17 years at Millhaven after a residency at a decent program in Cincinnati. He was not a bad doctor. He was, in fact, a reasonably competent one. But there is a specific disease that grows in small institutions, a calcification of the ego, that happens when a man becomes the smartest person in every room he walks into for long enough. Holt had it bad. He had a particular tone he used with non-clinical staff. Not cruel, exactly. Just absent. Like they occupied a different layer of reality than he did. Nurses got full sentences. Techs got fragments. Custodians got hand gestures. Ivy was aware of none of this in any way that troubled her. She'd been managed by a warrant officer who communicated exclusively through disappointment and silence for 14 months in a forward operating base outside Kandahar. Holt was a mild inconvenience. The morning it happened, she was on the east corridor, replacing a flickering fluorescent tube above the visitor alcove. She had the stepladder out, the old tube already down, new one waiting. She noticed from the elevated vantage that the man in the chair by the window, the one she'd seen come in an hour ago with his daughter, both of them sitting very still the way people sit when they're scared, was not looking right. His color had shifted. Subtle, but she'd been trained to notice subtle. There was a faint blue undertone around his mouth, His breathing was too shallow, too fast, and he was holding himself carefully, the way people hold themselves when movement causes pain they're trying not to show. She came down off the ladder. She walked to the nurse's station. The charge nurse, Chen, was on the phone. Ivy waited. Chen held up a finger without looking at her. Ivy said quietly, "The man in the visitor alcove, East Corridor. I think he's in distress. His lips have got some cyanosis and he's guarding his breathing." Chen covered the receiver. "He's waiting for his wife to finish a procedure. He's not a patient. I understand, but I'll check on him when I'm done." Ivy looked back at the man. He was still sitting very still. His daughter had her hand on his arm and was looking at him with a tight expression. She walked to the alcove. She crouched down in front of him, level with his face. She kept her voice even, the way she'd learned to do in places where panic spreads faster than blood loss. "Sir, I work here. What's your name?" He looked at her with eyes that were working too hard. Ed, can you tell me where it hurts?" "Chest," he said it like. It cost him something. "Left started, maybe 20 minutes ago. Figured it was my back." "Has this happened before?" "No. Are you on any blood thinners? Aspirin?" He shook his head. Behind her she heard Holt's voice. She recognized it without turning. That particular baritone that filled hallways without trying, and she stood and turned and said, "This man needs to be evaluated. I think he may be having a cardiac event. He's got left-sided chest pain, onset 20 minutes, with cyanosis and compensatory breathing." Holt stopped walking. He looked at Ed. He looked at Ivy, really looked at her, at the gray uniform, at the name tag that said IVI Facilities. And something moved across his face that she'd seen before on a different kind of man in a different kind of place. Dismissal, dressed up as patience. "Ma'am," he said, "we appreciate you flagging it. We'll take a look." He turned to the nurse behind him. "Have someone check in on the gentleman in the alcove when—" "He needs an EKG, Ivy said. "Now, not in 10 minutes. There was a small silence. Holt turned back. "I'm sorry," he said. "And you are a custodian?" "Yes, right." He nodded slowly, the way adults nod at children who have said something earnest but incorrect. "Let us handle the medicine. That's what we're here for." Ivy held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at Ed, who was looking back at her with the eyes of a man who knows something is wrong but doesn't have the words for it. And she said quietly, just to him, "They'll take care of you." She picked up her stepladder and went back to the fluorescent tube. She was in the basement supply room 40 minutes later when she heard it. The distinct percussion of institutional chaos, which has its own sound, distinct from ordinary noise, a specific frequency of urgent footsteps and clipped voices, and the rattle of equipment moving fast. She'd heard it so many times that her body responded before her mind caught up. She was up the stairs before she'd made a decision. The East Corridor had flooded. A pipe in the ceiling, older than anyone in the building, corroded to a membrane, had given way, and 6 inches of water was spreading fast across the tile. Ceiling tiles had come down in chunks. A section of the drop ceiling near the visitor alcove had collapsed entirely, and the scaffolding behind it, the aluminum framing they'd been meaning to replace for 2 years, had buckled and come down on top of Ed, who was now on the floor. His daughter was screaming his name. The water was still rising, knee-deep in the low spots. There were staff in the corridor, 2 nurses, an orderly, a respiratory tech, standing at the perimeter, processing, the way people process sudden catastrophic change for the 2 or 3 seconds before they're able to act. Holt was there. He was on the phone. Ivy dropped to her knees in the water next to Ed before she'd taken a breath. The aluminum framing had caught him across the left shoulder and the upper chest. She could see from the way he was holding himself that something had shifted. And she knew, not from guessing, but from the particular grammar of injury she'd spent years learning, that the impact had compromised something already fragile. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, pulse rapid, thready, weak at the periphery. Trachea, midline not deviated, not yet. She put her hand flat on his chest, right side, then left. The left side was moving less. She looked up. The respiratory tech, young, early 20s, name tag said Parrish, was standing at the edge of the water. She pointed at him. What's your airway kit look like? He blinked. What? Airway kit. What do you carry? Bag valve, oral airways, pulse ox, chest decompression kit. Anything? That's not in my crash cart, she said. Where's the nearest crash cart? Station 2, one of the nurses said. But the water. Get it to the dry edge and hand me the needle cath. 14 gauge now. Nobody moved for a beat too long. Holt said, from somewhere behind her, "What exactly do you think you're doing?" She didn't look up from Ed. His trachea's midline, but the left chest is moving less than the right. Given the impact and his presentation before this happened, I think he had an evolving MI, and the trauma may have given him a hemothorax or a pneumo, if it's a tension pneumo, and we wait for the paramedics. She paused to check his pulse again. Weaker. We won't be waiting long for the other thing. You're a custodian, Holt said. The word had a different quality now, not dismissal. Something closer to genuine confusion. I know what I am. She looked up at him then, and she held his gaze, and she said, I need a 14-gauge needle catheter, and I need someone to hold his shoulders still. Can you do that, or should I find someone who can? 1 second. 2. The nurse who'd told her about Station 2 moved first. She went for the crash cart at a run. Holt crouched down across from Ivy without a word. Ed looked up at both of them. His lips were definitely blue now. His eyes were scared and clear. Ed, Ivy said, stay with me. I've done this before. You're going to be okay, he said very quietly. You're the janitor. I am, she said. I'm also the person who's going to fix this, so I need you to hold still. The nurse came back with the kit. Ivy opened it without looking, the way you do when your hands have done something so many times they stop needing your eyes. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, swabbed the site with what was available, and said to Holt, hold him. Holt held him. She placed the needle. The hiss was unmistakable. That specific release of pressure that means you got it right. That the air trapped in the wrong place has found its way out. That the lung on the left side is getting the room it needs. Ed's next breath was bigger than the last one. His color didn't change immediately. It takes a moment. But she felt the shift in his shoulders, the particular way the body relaxes when it stops fighting. She held the catheter in place and looked at Parrish. Secure this. Don't let it move. He came forward and did it, hands steadier than she expected. She sat back on her heels in the water, and for a moment she just let herself breathe. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes later. They worked efficiently, asked good questions, and were halfway through their assessment before the one with the lead patch looked at the catheter in Ed's chest and said, Who placed this? Parrish pointed at Ivy. The paramedic looked at her uniform, then at the needle, then at Ivy. Your facilities? Custodial, she said. He looked at the placement, textbook. He looked back at her. He didn't say anything else, but he nodded. Once, the way people nod when they're revising something they thought they understood. They loaded Ed and moved. His daughter, whose name was Becca, grabbed Ivy's hand as she passed and couldn't seem to find words, so she just held on for a moment. And then she was gone too, through the doors, into the rain. The corridor was quiet the way places get quiet after something violent has moved through them. Water still on the floor, ceiling tiles in pieces. The fluorescent tube she'd never finished installing, still sitting on the stepladder she'd abandoned. Holt was standing with his back to her, hands in his coat pockets. She was wringing water from the hem of her uniform shirt when he turned around. He looked at her for a long time. The expression on his face was not one she'd seen from him before. Complicated, like a man trying to reconcile two things that refuse to fit together. "Where?" he said finally. "Did you learn to do that?" She considered the question. There was the Army recruiter who'd shown up at her high school in rural Kentucky and told her she was the kind of person the military needed. There was Fort Sam Houston, the 68W course, 68 weeks of trauma medicine crammed into a body that had grown up hunting deer and setting broken limbs on livestock because the nearest vet was an hour away. There was Bagram, and then Kandahar, and then a third deployment to a place she still doesn't name in conversations. There was Sergeant Yates, who had died on a Wednesday from a wound she'd been 2 minutes too late to reach, and whose face she still saw sometimes in the specific dark that exists between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. There was the day she'd come home and realized she couldn't go back into clinical work. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That the gap between the version of herself that could function in that world and the version that existed now was too wide to cross without a bridge she hadn't built yet. There was the listing. Facilities technician, part-time, flexible schedule. "I trained as a combat medic," she said. 3 deployments. 6 years. Holt said nothing. "The Army calls it 68 whiskey," she said. "Trauma medicine in the field, no backup, no imaging, no time." He looked at the spot where Ed had been lying, where the water was just beginning to recede. "Why are you?" He stopped, reconsidered, started again. "Why did you take a custodial job?" She looked at him. She thought about answering that fully, about telling him what it costs to carry the weight of those years in a body that still flinches at certain sounds, about the way the work had followed her home and lived behind her eyes, about the particular grief of having been very good at something that required being in the worst moments of other people's lives and being unable to find the door back to an ordinary version of yourself. She thought about telling him all of that. Instead, she said, "I needed something simple for a while." Holt absorbed this. She could see him absorbing it, recalibrating, the way people do when they realize the map they've been using doesn't match the territory. "I dismissed what you said," he said. "Earlier, when you flagged him, yes, if we'd gotten to him sooner, he might have had the event under controlled circumstances rather than in a flooded hallway with a ceiling on him." She said it without heat. "Possibly. We don't know." He nodded. It wasn't the nodding he'd done before. This was different. This was a man accepting something uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe Ed a better outcome than what almost happened," she said. "The apology is secondary." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, quietly, "Fair enough." Ed Kowalski, that was his full name. She'd learned it from Becca's frantic call to the charge nurse. Was transported to regional and underwent surgery that night. A dissecting aortic aneurysm, they found, the cardiac event that had been building before Holt ever stepped into that hallway. The blunt trauma from the ceiling had accelerated what was already coming. He survived. It was close. Becca called the hospital 3 days later and asked to speak to the woman from custodial services who'd been with her father. Chen took the message, wrote it on a yellow sticky note, and put it on Ivy's cart while she was doing the third-floor rooms. She found it when she came back down. She stood in the supply corridor and read it. Becca Kowalski K. called. Says to say thank you. Her father is home. He's already complaining about the hospital food, which she says means he's fine. Ivy read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her front pocket, where she kept things she didn't want to lose. The thing about carrying a past like hers is that it doesn't disappear when you change your name tag. It doesn't dissolve in mop water or get left in a supply closet or clock out at the end of a shift. She'd learned that. She was still learning it. What she'd also learned, on a forward operating base, in a tent where the temperature hit 114 and the nearest surgeon was a satellite call away, was that skill doesn't ask permission. That it lives in the body, not the credential. That when someone is dying in front of you, and you are the only person in the building who knows what to do, the uniform you're wearing is the least interesting thing in the room. She went back to the east corridor the next morning with a new fluorescent tube. The ceiling was still a construction zone. Yellow tape across the alcove. The aluminum scaffolding had been cleared. Somebody had put a small folding sign. We apologize for the inconvenience, where the chairs used to be, which she thought was a very specific kind of human response to a very specific kind of event. She set up the stepladder. She climbed. She installed the tube, and the light came on, clean and even, flooding the alcove in white. Below her, the corridor hummed with its ordinary sounds. The squeak of rubber soles, the roll of a cart, someone's radio at the nurse's station playing something low and country. An ordinary morning in a small hospital in a county that hadn't grown in 20 years. She climbed back down. She folded the stepladder under her arm, positioned her cart, and moved on to the next room on her list. Behind her, the light stayed on.